Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea Seritan. I'm one of the faculty leads of our department's Climate Change and Mental Health Task Force, and it is my true pleasure to introduce the speakers for our inaugural annual Grand Rounds on Climate Change and Mental Health, Drs. Robin Cooper and Alex Trope. Dr. Robin Cooper is a volunteer clinical associate professor in our department. She received her MD at Albert Einstein Medical School in New York City, followed by residency here at UCSF. Throughout her career, Dr. Cooper has worn many hats as an educator and activist. She is the co-founder and lead on the steering committee of Climate Psychiatry Alliance, a group dedicated to understanding, education, and advocacy about the specific impact of climate change on mental health. Dr. Alex Trope is a clinical instructor in our department and a recent graduate of our residency program. He is a longtime climate activist as well. During medical school at UCSF, Dr. Trope was a UC Carbon Neutrality Initiative Fellow, focusing his work on climate communication through a health lens. He later became the youngest founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, where he now helps maintain a climate-aware therapist referral system to connect interested clients to therapists adept at working with climate-related distress. Before we start, there will be a Q&A session at approximately 9:20 a.m. If you have questions for Drs. Cooper and Trope, please submit them via the public chat box. They also wanted you to know that if they don't get to all your questions, they're happy to continue to answer them by email. And now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Robin Cooper.
Actually, I'm going to have Alex do the beginning part. So go ahead, Alex.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Andrea. So this is the title of our presentation, and you'll see that we don't actually focus that much on climate denial. I think a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists spend a lot of time trying to understand that process, but now we are boldly in a new era where we can move beyond that. These are our learning objectives. We'd like you to know about the general impacts of climate change on mental health. And this presentation, especially, we've updated it and really focused on solutions through a psychiatric lens for well-being in the climate era. This might be familiar to many of you. The 2010s was a decade whereby so many years matched or broke the record on global surface temperature and heat generally. And so 2020, the year that just passed, was tied the hottest year yet of 2016. And we get to this point because of a relatively short history of using fossil fuels. In the 1880s is when coal really began to take its place as the chief energy source of the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. And then in the post-war period, oil and gas were added to that in a period that is still ongoing called the Great Acceleration, whereby the consumption of fossil fuel, but also all the things related to that and the consumption of the world's resources generally really took off in an exponential fashion. And within a few decades, environmental movements were already acknowledging that there must be limits to growth on a finite Earth, and that there were many planetary boundaries we would be coming up against that would test our ability to maintain a habitable Earth. And what we want to draw people's attention to throughout this presentation is that we have climate change already baked into our system. It is occurring, it's been occurring, and we have the ability to prevent catastrophic climate change in so many ways over the next decade, especially, which offers this incredibly important but also closing window of opportunity that I think we can all take advantage of. And former President Obama, or his speechwriter, said this really succinctly and beautifully in my mind. We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who could do something about it. So we hope that's a motivating factor here. And we are now in 2021, after the decade of the 2010s in which records of heat and consumption were met almost every year. We now have a new administration that made it a central part of their platform and now a central part of their administration to mainstream climate policy domestically and internationally. Besides taking over 40 executive actions on his first day related to the environment and climate change, President Biden has appointed both a domestic climate czar, Gina McCarthy, a former EPA administrator with a long history of environmental justice focus, and John Kerry, on international climate envoy now, both with these cabinet level positions that mean to coordinate our response to climate change and our climate mobilization with that of the rest of the world, which is key. And the signal is not only in the White House, but all across Wall Street and the markets that climate change is a risk, as well as fossil fuels are a risk to business. So we have BlackRock's chief saying that they have to make aggressive climate goals to eliminate greenhouse gases by 2050. We have GM, you might have seen famously in the Super Bowl, saying that we'll sell only zero emission vehicles by 2035. And then we have the Chamber of Commerce saying that the administration and legislators have to make a unified position so that businesses know how to deal with with climate change and with all the different regulation or rules that might be in place. For us here in psychiatry, we have been working on this presentation in different forms, and we've always thought of climate psychiatry as containing different buckets. For this one, I think we've really succinctly narrowed it down to just 4 buckets. There's heat, disasters, displacement, and eco-distress. And under each of those, we will have a case to describe that, and we'll end on these solutions that will be layered in 3 different kind of strata: individual patient management, systems of care, and public health and advocacy. This is just a description of those again, with the reference to the structure of each of these. We'll have a case vignette, we'll have the info on that bucket, and then we'll have solutions and lessons for you guys to consider. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Robin Cooper with our first bucket of heat.
So, good morning. So I'm going to be discussing the impacts of extreme heat waves. I'm not going to be talking about the gradual global warming and baseline heat in our communities. Now, those of us in the Bay Area know that we've all been experiencing heat waves, even in our city, where we have our natural air conditioning of the Pacific Ocean. And I'm going to start with our case. So during the weekend call shift at San Francisco General Hospital inpatient unit, you're called to see a 45-year-old Black man with a history of schizoaffective disease, bipolar type. He was admitted several weeks ago for mania and now stabilized on lithium, and he's preparing for discharge. Temperatures have been above 85 degrees for the last 5 days. And of course, anyone who works in our area knows that psych wards are on the top floor of hospitals and have no air conditioning. The patient is now lethargic, sluggish, and mildly agitated. He lives in a downtown SRO without air conditioning and very poor ventilation. He's estranged from his family, and his income is through SSDI. So, next slide. I want to review with you some of the extreme impacts of the heat impacts on mental illness, and they span a wide range of areas. And I'm going to go into these as we speak about them. Next slide. So we all feel pretty cranky and have temper flares and often feel listless during heat waves. We all feel this. Our colloquial language expresses this when we speak about being hot-headed or simmering anger, or I'm so angry that my blood is boiling, or the admonition to cool out, man, stay cool if we're over agitated. Next. But extreme heat impacts go far beyond crankiness, with significant impacts on mental health and behavior, especially for people who already have fragile and erratic impulse control, just as our patient on the unit showed us. There is mounting good scientific evidence that has substantiated this general understanding, with data showing that there are increases in interpersonal and intergroup violence during periods of extreme heat. Now, this is of great concern to me, especially for the impact on child and domestic partner abuse. This experience with extreme heat and violence is a worldwide phenomenon. It's seen everywhere. And although we know that violence is a very complex, multifactorial determined behavior, there now seem to be plausible hypotheses that there are biological contributions linking the role of serotonin metabolism as a contributing factor. Serotonin levels fall as heat rises, and serotonin is associated not only with mood difficulties, but aggressive behavior. And it's hypothesized that serotonin depletion can contribute to violent acts under stress. This is something that needs more evaluation and research. Next slide. But suicide also increases with rising temperatures. And I consider suicide aggression toward the self. There are a number of descriptive studies that report increases in suicide with extreme heat. But just as with violence, suicide has many complex contributors. However, there's an important study done by a researcher just down in the peninsula at Stanford, economic research team led by Marshall Burke, that has attempted to factor out all of those many other variables and look specifically at the impact of heat alone. And they've come up with some dramatic findings. There's a 0.7% increase in the United States and 2.1 increase in Mexico for each 1 degree centigrade over the monthly average temperature for that area. And these increases are across all socioeconomic levels, which I found surprising. Marshall Burke postulates that if there are no reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, he projects that there will be 21,000 more suicides by 2015 due to heat alone. And I want to just underscore, if there are no decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, that gives us opportunities. That increase would wipe out all of the gains in suicide prevention programs, gun control policies, and other efforts at impacting suicide. Now, there are other areas that are impacted by extreme heat, and I'm not going to go into these in depth, but definitely mood is impacted with depression, cognition is impaired, and sleep is interrupted with extreme heat. And all of these have contributions to mental health difficulties and aggravate mental illnesses. And for us in psychiatry, we must be aware that our medications that we use, our psychopedia, have particular risks for our patients because many of them interfere with the body's normal regulatory mechanisms of cooling and with interference in sweating. Excess sweating, of course, leads to fluid loss, and that often puts patients who are on lithium at risk for toxicity. And think about that, about the patient that we had on the inpatient unit. Signs of heat exhaustion and high lithium toxicity can go unnoticed or unrecognized by our patients. So, next slide. I want to emphasize that there are places where things are worse in terms of the heat impacts, and particularly the impact of the urban heat island effect. The hard surfaces and dense structures and lack of green planting in inner cities can create up to a 10-degree increase in temperatures compared to the adjacent suburban and rural areas, and that these increases may explain something about summer violence seen in inner cities. That impact contributes to urban poor, who often have substandard housing and often lack air conditioners. On top of this urban heat effect, suffering from much greater effects. Next slide. Now, heat, just as with all of the aspects of climate affected impacts, do not hit people equally. The wealthy and those with access to resources fare much better. And those who lack resources, power, wealth, and many communities of color are the first and the most hardest hit by the impacts of climate change. Next slide. Now, there are particular groups at risk for heat, and particularly, as I said, those who lack political and economic resources, and those at the extremes of our life cycle, the children and elderly. But I'm not going to go into this slide in depth. I want to point out in the next slide that we as mental health providers must pay attention to the mentally ill and the substance abusers, the silent population that we must speak for. These are a very vulnerable population. In fact, schizophrenics may have an inherent inability to experience internal heat due to the illness itself. And add on that impaired executive functioning that makes it difficult to either respond or take appropriate actions to protect themselves, makes the population of the mentally ill very concerning. In fact, increased hospital admissions and emergency room visits during heat waves are much greater for those with psychiatric illness. Pre-existing mental illness alone triples 3 times the risk of mortality during extreme heat over patients with no prior psychiatric illness. And of course, the homeless, who cannot provide safe shelter from exposure to extreme heat. And we know how profound the increases in mental illness are in our homeless population. Next slide. Now, there are solutions. We can do something about the impacts and manage the impacts of extreme heat. At an individual patient level, there are many guides, and I have written a health effects toolkit to be used by patients to help them understand what they can do. That's available on my website at Climate Psychiatry Alliance. And that toolkit, I will be working with Lisa Fortuna at San Francisco General to translate that into Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese and make brochures available to our clinics. At a systems level, we must have robust case management, and we must be able to reach out to our most vulnerable groups. We have to provide shelter, water stations, and cooling environments for those who don't have that in their own homes. And the advanced warning systems have to be something that can be used by our vulnerable patients. And in our clinics and agencies, I think we need to develop a culture of attention to the heat impacts. At the policy level, we need to be attentive and develop policies for our built environment and creating green spaces. Our housing policies must be addressed. And I'm going to say this for every aspect of climate change. Any policy that directly tries to impact and mitigate global warming is a health solution. So, lessons from this particular area. Heat waves, we will have them here, and we will have them more and more, even though we're in a temperate area. Heat impacts are a risk multiplier, aggravating pre-existing medical conditions and amplifying inequalities. The symptoms range from mood, behavior, cognition, and interfere with circadian rhythm. Our medication impacts and risks to medications need to be attended to. But I want to say, we can manage these impacts if we attend to them, but we have to do it before the heat waves. And I'm going to turn it back to Alex for the next section.
Thank you. So I'll be reviewing disasters, and they come in a few different forms, but I want to illustrate them through this case of Jason, a 40-year-old man with no past psych history, presenting to the clinic as a new patient following feelings of depression and stress in the setting of being displaced from his family home and his community ties after a Northern California wildfire 6 months ago. As we all know, especially from this last August and September 2020, wildfire is an increasingly common acute climate disaster all over the world, but especially in California and the West Coast. And the number of acres burned annually over the last 3 years here in California is really staggering. We've had the first mega acreage fires, over 1 million acres burned in just a single fire. And in 2020, that total, that was the area of the state of Rhode Island. And of course, we experienced throughout September in our wildfire season some of the most toxic air quality in the world, which on top of COVID just kept us in our homes in really dire straits. After any acute disaster, there is a constellation of psychological and behavioral responses, and they overlap in some ways and luckily disaggregate in others. There's the general distress response, in which people's sleep is often changed. There's a reduced sense of safety, there's irritability or distraction, and there can be isolation and avoidance. And some people self-medicate or otherwise try to adapt to this distress response with risky health behaviors. Their substance use increases, they do other addictive behaviors, whether that is work or other distracting behaviors. And oftentimes they feel a real compelling sense of separation anxiety, either from their community, from their loved ones, from friends. And some of these are adaptive in the sense of separation anxiety or wanting to work on the problem, can in some ways be adaptive, but there's a small subgroup of people who, through the distress and risky health behaviors, slide into psychiatric disorder or have exacerbations of their psychiatric disorder. The important part to stress here is that it's only a minority of people who experience a disaster that have qualified PTSD some months out from that. So it's important to know that there is a huge resilience factor in all of this. And this graph here actually helps to show why there might be points of resilience in any disaster. This is by one of our friends in the disaster psychiatry working group, the APA, which shows emotional highs and lows that occur prior to, with the disaster, and in the post-disaster phase. So oftentimes there's a slide, as we'll get into in a few slides, no disaster is really pre-disaster. There's smoldering, slow and small level disasters that are feeding into the larger acute disaster. And then were described actually very poignantly in a book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, which shows that in many disasters, there's this heroic and honeymoon where people feel on emotional highs. They feel a sense of social cohesion they've never known. They feel like they get to know their neighbors, like they get to see their community. And that often gives them a sense of purpose they don't know in their status quo life. But then as the damage is assessed, as all the stressors of trying to rebuild, as oftentimes people flee and are not even in the area to rebuild, there's a sense of disillusionment. And this comes with varying vicissitudes, and it's a long tail, and not everyone's emotional phase graph will look like this. It's very variable. But hopefully some people do get back to a baseline that's either above or at their pre-disaster level by working through their grief, by coming together in community. But there are, as with the graph before, a subgroup of people who will never regain that kind of emotional functioning and will stay in these emotional lows and behavioral lows for a long time coming. As I said, no acute disaster emerges de novo. There are all these slow-moving man-made or natural, even though that distinction is very hard to make these days, that precede acute ones. For example, our fire seasons the last 3 years were preceded by the Great California Drought of 2011 to 2017. That was the slow-moving disaster that caused all types of displacement and economic ruin in the Central Valley and other places on its own. It led to over 100 million trees dying, which are tinder, or like create the tinderbox for these huge wildfire seasons. And it came with historic low water Sierra snowpack levels in a water-starved state already. And its attention to the unique health impacts of any acute disaster that might occur in a region that really makes climate psychiatry and any other climate-informed medical specialty work. So we don't personally experience that many huge hurricanes or storms, but it's important in those contexts to really understand some of the highest mortality and injury points there. I found it interesting that carbon monoxide poisoning is actually a huge issue in those places because the leaks in gas systems with hurricanes and other disruption. For us, it's important to know that besides the direct threat of wildfire and destruction of homes and communities, we see all over Northern California and any place experiencing wildfires, a huge morbidity and mortality attributable to the air pollution and the toxic air, which all but sets back any gains we've made in the past 30 years with the Clean Air Act. It's quite sad. So air pollution is an interesting thing. It's both driving climate change through the CO2 and other greenhouse gas, and it directly affects health, which is amazing because it has direct impacts from the minute you cut off emissions. We can reduce acute exposures, which cause respiratory distress and asthma. As we say, the vulnerable populations of the medically ill, elderly, and children are most at risk when there's toxic air quality or when there's chronic toxic air quality, such as communities that live on the side of highways. And children have their activity even more restricted, which of course for children, as anyone else, causes a lot of mental health fallout. And this comes with increasing anxiety and distress amongst parents, caregivers, almost everyone. What's interesting for our specialties is that carbon pollution is now linked closely to neuroinflammation, which is having its heyday of mechanistic kind of understanding of various psychiatric illness. So for example, when Chevron oil refinery across the bay from us flares off its gas and pours huge amounts of carbon pollution into the air, someone in Richmond could breathe that in. They could have direct particles go through their olfactory bulb and gain access to the brain. It could irritate their epithelia and cause inflammation, and then it can go and through mechanical inhalation, enter the bloodstream, and then enter the brain through there. This is one of the mechanisms behind this burgeoning field of brain pollution, really understanding how pollution generally, but especially air pollution, has links to a variety of neuropsychiatric and neurocognitive disorders across the lifespan again, and often concentrating in those extremes of life in the young and the elderly. So for us, we have a disaster psychiatry toolkit, much like the heat effects toolkit, available through the APA and SAMHSA. The acknowledgement that there's treatment challenges in the short term and long term, and they're much different. There's psychiatric first aid, which is in the extremely short term, which has its own goals. There's managing symptoms in the short term, and then hopefully building on personal, social, and community resilience and ties, and actually retying that network in the longer term. In terms of system of care, trauma-based therapies in post-disaster zones is a burgeoning but well-known area, and it takes really the quarterback role of psychiatry and psychology and others to do that well. We're inspired by the transformational resilience movement, which kind of institutes and is a warehouse for many different community-based practices and policies, and they have now helped to write legislation at the federal level to make a climate resilient United States over the next 10 years. And then public health, we need to fund disaster preparedness and response. We need to make it a regular part of our understanding. And I think people, especially in the COVID era, understand that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of action in the face of disaster. We need to manage the urban wildlife interface, and that's by changing local land use policies and zoning. And that will come with some pain. So we do have to make sure that we're aware of who we're causing pain when making these changes. So lessons from disasters: there's a loss of a social network, a loss of access to basic needs, whether that's directly by destroying things or simply by cutting people off from their regular means of accessing food and water. there's a breakdown of the healthcare delivery system, which I think is super key, because at the exact moment when the healthcare delivery system should be amping up and needs to be delivering more care across mental health and medical areas, there's sometimes a complete breakdown. We saw that just recently in Texas, where hospitals and other places lacked electricity and water and heating. And then there's this vicious cycle we get into more and more as this century continues, in which there's constant slow-moving disasters like drought, like increasing heat, that transform into acute events with this very prolonged reconstruction phase. And we have to be aware of that and how to mobilize in relation to an acute disaster and a slow-moving. Air pollution and the idea of brain pollution is a place that should be integrated into all our training. And we should understand that reconstruction recovery is long and nonlinear. There's highs and lows, and not everyone recovers, especially when they get stuck in this vicious cycle, whereby one disaster might dislocate them or cause loss of resources that puts them at risk of another disaster. This is famously represented in the New Orleans diaspora that left after Hurricane Katrina, only to land in Texas and especially Houston and experience another hurricane with disastrous consequences there. This goes right into our third bucket, displacement. Dislocation, displacement is, I really think, over my time studying this, the chief theme of what this century will be defined by. I'm kind of heartened by the idea that displacement and the changing of the geographic distribution of peoples and resources is actually also a defining feature of the 20th century. It was just done under the guise of, economic imperative or anything like that. So we've already experienced this at a huge scale, but now it's being compelled by climate disasters and other changes. So Araceli is a 32-year-old woman with 2 children presenting to the Trauma Recovery Center for an asylum evaluation. She fled Guatemala, where her husband was tortured and killed after posing predatory debts that he and other rural farmers had accumulated, all while attempting to farm through years of drought and then catastrophic flooding that has occurred in Central America. She's experiencing telltale signs of PTSD and feels she is now at risk of debts she owes to human smugglers who transported her and her children into the US. So displacement is an issue all over the world, and at our current moment, upwards of 70 million people are forcibly displaced. This doesn't even include economic displacement of people searching for a better life or opportunities. Around 40 million are internally displaced within the borders of their own country. Oftentimes, they don't even have citizen or representation in that country. And then refugees crossing borders, and then asylum seekers specifically looking to get citizenship in the area where they're fleeing to. And this is represented by the internal displacement of Katrina and all the kind of Katrina diaspora that occurred, by the international border refugees in the Mediterranean, especially in the past summers, and by the migrant caravans going through Central America and Mexico, looking to reach the US border. This will only worsen, but once again, we have a huge closing window of opportunity here. 1% of the world is a barely livable hot zone now. If things are unabated and business as usual continues, by 2070, that portion could go up to 20%, in which it is actually difficult to live and sustain life in that area due to chronic heat and other disasters. And billions of people call this land home. But importantly, this uninhabitable earth, where 1/5 of our land it cannot sustain the level of population it has now, this could change drastically if we only focus on reducing our emissions. So we have this window. If we take drastic but conceivably beneficial actions to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, we could have anywhere between 25 million to 1 billion people displaced in the next 30 years. So if we take a hopeful but still challenging view that maybe it's 200 million, that's 1 out of every 45 people. I think we could handle that, even though it will be very sad. But it gives us real pause that it's not just about saving the earth. It's literally about saving people and being able them to be able to stay in the places where they live, where they probably love and have their resources. And that's really what the global climate century is about. I've described the physical displacement, but I want to home in on 2 ideas. First of all, that there's this invisible displacement that we are all feeling now with COVID-19. We might not be pushed from our homes, although many people are pushed from our homes, and that's why there's a push for rent moratorium. But COVID-19 has displaced us from our usual habits and places of work and leisure and socializing. There's also emotional displacement, which anyone who's studied psychoanalysis knows that that's a basic defense mechanism in which negative emotion from an original source is moved to a less threatening, more vulnerable recipient, as from your boss to your family or otherwise. And then there's identity displacement, this idea that comes from eco-psychology that place really shapes the person and that you can't be the same person by losing completely your ties to the place. So when we talk about emotional and physical displacement, they really overlap in the migrant and crisis, whereby we saw in areas of the Mediterranean, in Katrina diaspora, with our former President Trump, that there's this tendency by especially the elites to make migrants the other and the enemy at the very time that they are suffering the most from these crises. So we hope that this emotional displacement doesn't take place, and we recognize when it does. So for solutions, UCSF, the Department of Psychiatry, has made it a priority to support forensic evaluation of asylum seekers. And within any of your patient assessments, I think expanding the social history to really understand the place that that person comes from or is in, and to understand any displacement as a social determinant of mental health, whether it's internal, invisible, what have you. And then systems of care. There's some great examples through the WHO, the mental health gap, which is a great resource for scaling up care for mental, neurological, and substance use disorders in displaced peoples. And then, as we said before, non-specialist or paraprofessional training initiatives are really, really helpful. There's a great one using interpersonal therapy in the Middle East and other places, and Susan Meffert here at UCSF has done some research on that. And then we need to focus on improving living conditions and resilience factors in the vulnerable places so that people can stay where they want to. In our case, for example, providing unconditional foreign aid to farmers to let them farm instead of falling prey to predatory creditors would be a fantastic move forward, instead of all these earmarked foreign aid initiatives that we've known for so long. And President Biden just signed an executive action asking for a report on options for the protection and resettlement of individuals displaced by climate change. And we hope when that report comes out that advocates really hold his administration's feet to the fire on making that happen. So overall, with displacement, I think it's a chief theme of climate psychiatry. We're living on a planet with less habitable space now, but our actions in this decade can make all the difference in changing it from a truly catastrophic situation to one that we can adapt to and manage. Displacement occurs in dramatic and invisible forms. It's very challenging to immigration policies and international cooperation, which we need to coordinate a climate mobilization. And like all our other buckets here, it's a risk multiplier to racial, ethnic, and economic inequities. And we want to focus especially on emotional displacement, that it can, kind of burst into violence or scapegoating of the most vulnerable when they need our help. And I'll pass it to Robin Cooper for our last bucket on eco-distress.
So there is increasing attention to the burgeoning field of eco-psychology, which addresses the emotional responses associated with the perceptions about climate change, even among people who have not personally experienced any direct impacts. These are considered psychoterratic syndromes. That is the constellation of emotions and mental health impacts associated with environmental damage and change, about the uncertainty of the future environmental degradation and potential societal collapse. There's been much written about this in the press. It is by far the biggest subject that journalists ask us at the Climate Psychiatry Alliance to address, and is more and more in the professional literature. So our case, Margaret, she's a 43-year-old single woman seeking therapy. She says she wants a therapist who will not scoff at her or dismiss her anxiety about climate disruption. Despite her baseline concern and worry about climate change, which she describes as an existential threat to civilization, Margaret has recently been flooded with anxiety and thoughts that have taken over her mind since the wildfire smoke. She is having trouble functioning and doing her normal work tasks. Although we now have a sense of, go ahead to the next slide. Although we do not have a sense of just how many people suffer from these syndromes, I and my colleagues are seeing this in our practices more and more, and community support groups are attracting many people who are looking for assistance. Surveys, including the Yale Center for Communications, report mounting worries in the United States population, and these are replicated in many international surveys. Now, anxiety is not the only negative emotion associated with climate change. There's a wide range of feelings: hopelessness, anger, sadness, grief, but anxiety seems to be particularly significant one because it captures that sense of worry and concern about the unknown future. What we are now beginning to talk about is a pre-traumatic stress response. And solastalgia. This is a deep feeling of sadness and grief as we experience the scarring of the earth, representing our inability to find solace where we have previously been comforted. It combines the word solace with the word algia, which means pain. Next slide. Now, eco-anxiety, it can be an overwhelming state of profound worry, anxiety, or depression. There's a kind of sense of unregulated and overwhelming states of feelings that in an additional sense of feeling so small in the face of such large threats, feeling ineffective and powerless. The thoughts can be obsessive, ruminative, and profoundly unproductive. And there can be oscillating states between numbness and shutdown to being overwhelmed and flooded with intrusive thoughts and feelings. This interferes with functioning. It's not a good place to be. Margaret, our patient, is in trouble. And this requires our clinical skills. However, eco-anxiety should not be assumed to be pathological. We should feel distressed when faced with real threats that are wide-ranging. Our biology functions that way. In fact, anxiety can serve as an adaptive function, awakening us and signaling a threat and motivating us to act appropriately. Now, we get into difficulties when the feelings intrude and cannot be managed and tolerated. But contrast that to the state of anxiety, grief that is more regulated, a state of tolerating and accepting anxiety and grief. Worry, concern, and sadness is not maladaptive. It is a normal reaction to adverse circumstances. And building upon this, there is the awareness that anxiety and worry about our environment takes us to this idea of resiliency. Alex has also already mentioned that. Resilience describes the ability of the organism, the individual or community to cope with, to adapt to, and develop in the face of stressors. And community resilience is based on the ability to form strong social networks and attachments. It is based on a sense of cooperation and altruism, requires resources for communities and strong community leaders. And the interaction between individual and community resilience builds on each other and increases that level of resiliency. Building community resilience can entail partnerships with community organization and health groups. I want to speak to the need for a new paradigm. Although we cannot neglect individuals who are suffering severe symptoms, and we have to use all of our therapeutic tools for helping these people with emotional regulation, we must begin to rethink the delivery of mental health services. The luxury of a one-on-one treatment model where we only focus on symptoms that arise has become a thing of the past. Not only does our mental health system not have the capacity for this treatment, but more importantly, this does not build the skills, resources, and social connections that are so essential to building strong, resilient communities to prevent and manage widespread emotional and behavioral problems. We need a population level approach, not one that focuses only on treating high-risk individuals, but one that prioritizes preparing for problems, not only treating them after they appear. This new paradigm holds the awareness that climate change's emotional responses are not solely intrapsychic experiences or individual failings to cope, but are real social, economic, and political problems that require action. Engagement in building those strong networks of community resilience are an essential shift and incorporates the understanding that problems are enhanced by responding to problems are enhanced by this social community connectedness and self-empowerment. This creates real social and political solutions while also simultaneously being a mental health well-being tool in and of itself. So the next slide, we're going to go through some of those solutions, and this is only a tidbit. For the individual level, we can neither pathologize nor dismiss our diagnostic skills in evaluating patients that we see. We have so many tools in our toolbox that help with emotional regulation, mindfulness, emotional regulation, and nature as a regenerative tool. And Alex has also, I think Andrea may have said, Alex has been involved in the creation of a climate-aware therapists referral network to try to connect people who are looking for climate-aware therapists. And it's a project that we at the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance are jointly doing. At the systems level, I've already spoken about this profound need to have a paradigm shift from an individual to a public health perspective. We need to develop community support groups, and this is happening in many spheres, both led by lay leaders, and the Good Grief Network is one example, and professionals. And many of those leaders in the Climate Psychology Alliance are leading climate cafes, drop-in groups for support. And Alex has also spoken about this profound need for transformational resilience, building resilient communities. Now, at the policy level, Nancy Pelosi has popularized the idea on a button of hers, don't agonize, organize. And I want to underscore how profoundly important it is for those of us in the healthcare sector to involve ourselves with advocacy and engagement. There is in impacting policies that have both climate impacts and health impacts. And we have to also allocate resources for communities to develop what is needed. Next slide. Our lessons from eco-distress. They're not an official diagnosis, these eco-distress syndromes. Reactions can span the normal to overwhelming states of emotional distress. Therapy cannot sustain at a one-on-one level, and we need a paradigm to move from the couch to on-the-ground community interventions. and engagement and advocacy both addresses the underlying problems as well as being an emotional well-being tool. It's a twofer. So for our solutions, I'm going to move to showing you some of the groups that are involved. And these are only a small group, there's zillions, but our Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which Alex and I are involved in. And I'll just let you know, this Saturday is our general membership meeting. By all means, join us, join us. Our Psychology Alliance colleagues are also an important group. They have numerous events listed in their monthly on their website. At a policy level, there is so much going on legislatively in this new at the state level in California with many climate-related bills. And Climate Health Now and the Bay Area Physicians for Social Responsibility group are actively involved with these efforts. At a national level, there are numerous policies, and we're so hopeful about the new Congress and Biden's leadership there. And I can't forget to mention the awesome medical student leaders, the medical students for a sustainable future. If the world were in their hands, we would truly be blessed. Next slide. But right here at UCSF, in our own backyard, there is so much going on. UCSF is a major leader. All things climate can be found through the Office of Sustainability, with enormous activities happening here. And it also houses the fantastic health student group. UCSF has a carbon neutrality initiative with a goal of being carbon neutral by 2025. That's just around the corner. And the curriculum is being addressed at all levels and led by activist students to look at how we teach about climate change and health. And then in our own department, we have this wonderful task force on climate change and mental health. And there's a lot going on here. And I want to particularly highlight the curriculum work group with Andrea Saraton leading it. It's very busy. And Elisa Eppel is designing a study to look at the best practices for how using brief group supports in managing distress and helping people move to action. Next slide. So we hope that not only have we identified some of the very serious threats to mental health posed by climate change, but that we've given you a little bit of a sense of the possibilities of making a difference in what the future of this world will be. And also giving you a sense that engaging in this is not only hard work, as it is, but it brings a sense of meaning and profound engagement, both at the personal and interpersonal level. Alex and I can both attest to that, but I want to leave you with a much more beautiful way to say this.
The view we witness is round green and brilliant blue, which inspires us to ask deeply, wholly, what can we do? Open your eyes, know the future of this wise planet is right in sight, right in all of us. Trust this earth uprising, all of us bring light to exciting solutions never tried before, for it is our hope that implores us at our uncompromising core to keep rising up for an earth more than worth fighting for.
And just as as we end this, I want to make sure that you know that our work here has been contributed by the many, and particularly Dan Bernstein, a medical student from Stanford, has contributed some slides, and Beth Haas, one of our steering committee leaders at the Climate Psychiatry Alliance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation, Robin and Alex. Thank you. We have lots of questions, and let's see how many we can get through. First question for you. Could you comment on why there is so much focus on burning fossil fuels and so little on climate change caused by animal agriculture?
I can handle that a little bit. The inputs to animal agriculture are still defined by a fossil fuel system. The ability to move around animals and to have our food system work in such a non-local way would be different if there was a more decentralized. That being said, I think that there's a moral hazard to focusing on animal husbandry solely, because the climate denial industry, through the fossil fuels, they actually created the notion of a personal carbon footprint, and the notion that climate change can be solved by personal consumptive changes. So while absolutely it's important if people can cut out animal products, I think it also puts an unfair burden on some people, because those are some of the cheapest products now in terms of getting calories. So there's always a balance for me in describing that. I think it's very important, but also if you prematurely close that cognitive dissonance, eco distress you're having by saying, well, I'm doing a few things and I've changed my diet, then you don't get into this engagement focus around advocacy, around the large federal scale actions that need to occur, that of course will come down into animal agriculture at a time. But I do think there's a balance to be made, and you have to have the proper framing to really bring animal agriculture to the discussion, so that it doesn't just fall into a personal responsibility narrative.
But I want to, I completely agree with what Alex has said, but I also want to make another point. The greatest contribution to global warming is our dependency on a fossil fuel economy. That is clearly the most significant impact. Nevertheless, I think that we can't say that there's only one thing nor one solution. And the ways of impacting the world that we live in has to take into account the multiple additive ways that all aspects, and we could expand that to many things, to transportation, a significant impact, to buildings, to all sorts of things. Think about this as a puzzle with many different pieces that fit together.
Thank you so much for the emphasis on the multiple layers of the solutions as you've presented. Quick question, is there a book on climate psychiatry, or could you recommend one?
A book.
I don't think on the psychiatric side, but there are psychologists and psychoanalysts that have written beautifully on this.
It's not on the top of my mind. I will try to look into that, but there's the Eco America has a compilation of articles in regards to that.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, to all of those who are listening, we must write this book. We have to continue this work, which has just been started, and we have to learn and spread the word and absolutely write the book together.
And I want to just underscore that Andrea has also been a contributor to a book in the making.
Thank you all for these wonderful comments. Another question from Dr. Apple, our own Dr. Apple. How do you manage your own climate distress and stay positive?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, I just work on it. Doing the work makes me feel that my anxiety is very contained, and it gives me a sense of incredible meaning. And there's never an end to my to-do list.
Yeah, I agree with Robin. It's been I found her at the time at the end of medical school where I could no longer keep climate crisis and how it would affect my life, not only my profession, but the options I have going into middle age and as an older person at bay. It took over completely in an eco-anxiety fashion, and working on climate psychiatry with her and many others was hugely important. I want to also say that I think art is such an important contributor to resilience in the face of this. And I have an interesting facet, I've started to get into what they call cli-fi, climate fiction. There's a famous science fiction called Parable of the Sower, but that really is dystopic, but it helps hugely to recognize when my thoughts are fantasy and they're in the science fiction realm, at least currently, and how that differentiates from what I see around me. And it's really helped me. I think what I use to measure my climate anxiety is how do I enjoy the really good day? Because I think when climate anxiety is overwhelming, when you have a good day in the Bay Area, your thoughts just go to how the drought's going to come back, how there's not any rain, how those issues. And if you can really enjoy a very nice day, which will occur, even if there are these huge extremes of temperature, there will be very beautiful days all throughout this century. And we have to really harness those to come together with family and friends.
Thank you so much for these thoughts. And once again, for your outstanding presentation, Robin and Alex. And thank you for acknowledging the Climate Change and Mental Health Task Force. We put in the chat box the email address. Email us, email Robin and Alex. And thank you all for joining us. Don't agonize, organize.
Before we end, there have been several contributions in the chat people who have suggested some books for this, and that may be useful.
Thank you all.